There's a blue tarp folded into a rectangle the size of a paperback book, sitting on the ground next to a storm drain on the east side of Columbus, Ohio. That's the first thing you notice. Not the sleeping bag, not the cardboard, the tarp, folded that tight, that precise, sitting there like it matters. Because it does. Everything that keeps Caden alive through January comes back to that tarp. Caden Morse is 21 years old. He has a scar through his left eyebrow from a bike accident when he was 9, a jawline that runs sharp enough to catch shadow, and hair that used to be a rust brown, but has bleached uneven in patches from months of unfiltered sun and cold. He's not small. He takes up space when he stands. Broad shoulders, hands that look like they've moved a lot of weight. He doesn't carry much. A military-style duffel that holds maybe 30 pounds of everything he owns, a water bottle with the handle zip-tied back on, and that tarp. He's been sleeping outside for 11 months. Before that, he had a room in a house off Morse Road. That's actually not where his last name comes from. Just a coincidence he thinks is funny, shared with 2 other guys from the warehouse where he worked sorting packages. The warehouse closed. His roommates went back to family. Caden doesn't have family to go back to in the way that phrase usually means. He has an aunt in Akron he's spoken to maybe 4 times in his life. He has a father somewhere in the Florida Panhandle who he hasn't seen since he was 13. So when the room went away, there wasn't a backup plan. There was just the street. He didn't know anything about tarps. That's the thing most people get wrong about surviving outside in a northern winter. They think it's about layers. They think it's about sleeping bags and hand warmers and calorie counting and the right boots. All of that matters, but none of it is the problem. The problem is moisture. Moisture is what kills you, not cold air. Moisture-soaked everything. Wet clothes, wet ground, wet sleeping bag. A wet sleeping bag loses most of its insulating ability. You can be inside a sleeping bag rated to 20 degrees and still be in serious danger if what's around you is wet, and what's under you is wet, and what's overhead is collecting condensation and dripping onto you. At 3 in the morning, Caden learned all of this the wrong way. 3 weeks in January he spent soaked and shaking. Then he found the tarp. Or more accurately, a guy named Terrell found it for him. Terrell is 47. He's been outside, on and off, for 9 years. He sleeps near the same storm drain and has been there long enough that the city workers who drive past in the morning wave at him. He saw Caden shaking under a wet sleeping bag jammed under a highway overpass and said 4 words. You need a tarp. That was it. That was the beginning. Caden bought the tarp from a hardware store on Cleveland Avenue for $9.87. Blue polyethylene, 10 feet by 12 feet, with brass grommets around the perimeter. Nothing special. The kind of thing you'd throw over a woodpile or a car that needs to sit outside for a week. Not something you'd look at and think, that's a house. But it is. When you know what you're doing, it is. Terrell didn't give him a tutorial. That's not how he talks. He showed him once, then watched while Caden tried to replicate it. When Caden got it wrong, Terrell pointed at what was wrong without explaining why. Caden had to figure out the why himself, which meant he actually kept it. The things he worked out through trial and error are the things he still does today, exactly without thinking. The setup takes 22 minutes when Caden is moving at a normal pace. He's timed it because it matters. In the winter, in the dark, in the rain or sleet, 22 minutes is the target. If he's slower than that, something has gone wrong and he needs to figure out what. If he's faster, he's probably cut a corner and the shelter won't hold. Here's what 22 minutes looks like. Caden picks his location before dark. Always before dark. This is the first thing Terrell corrected him on, because Caden used to try to find spots after dark when it was harder to see who was watching and felt less exposed. Terrell told him he had it backwards. Finding a spot in the dark means you can't see what's around you, can't see whether the ground slopes towards you or away, can't see whether there's a drainage path that'll run water under you when it rains, can't see whether the surface you're about to put down cardboard on is concrete or gravel or packed dirt. In daylight, you can walk the spot, press on the ground with your boot, Look at the way the shadow falls to understand where the wind comes from. The spot Caden uses most often in winter is a recessed loading bay behind a closed-down appliance store on the east side. The bay is about 12 feet deep and 8 feet wide, 3 walls of concrete block and a roof overhang that extends maybe 4 feet out from the opening. It doesn't look like much. To Caden, it's a room with one wall missing, and the tarp closes that wall. He starts with the ground. 2 layers of cardboard go down first, overlapping at the seams by at least 6 inches. The reason for 6 inches is specific. Less than that, and you'll feel cold air moving through the gap when the temperature drops below 25. Caden learned the 6-inch rule by freezing through a 4-inch overlap one February night when the temperature went to 18. He doesn't need to remember the principle, he just knows the number. On top of the cardboard goes the first use of the tarp. This is the part most people don't know, because most tarp tutorials assume you have trees or poles or tent stakes and you're camping. Caden isn't camping. He has a concrete loading bay and a duffel bag, and whatever he can find. The tarp in his setup doesn't go overhead first. It goes underneath. Half of it. He folds the tarp so that roughly 5 feet of it lies flat on the cardboard, and the other 7 feet is available to come back over the top of him when he's lying down. This matters in a way that's hard to explain until you've spent a night on the ground in January. The ground steals heat faster than the air does. You can be bundled head to toe in a sleeping bag and a wool blanket and a hat and gloves, and still wake up at 2 in the morning cold to your core, because the cold is moving up through the ground and the cardboard and into your body. The tarp under you creates a barrier. Polyethylene doesn't breathe. Cold doesn't move through it the same way it moves through cardboard. The difference between one layer of cardboard and cardboard plus tarp is not the difference between uncomfortable and comfortable. It's the difference between sleeping and not sleeping. Caden gets into the sleeping bag first, then pulls the remaining 7 feet of tarp up over the sleeping bag and tucks the edges underneath him on both sides. He's now wrapped in the tarp the same way a burrito is wrapped. Ground layer under, side layers folded in, top layer over. The sleeping bag is inside the tarp, not on top of it. This is the opposite of how most people would arrange this. And the opposite is right for one specific reason: condensation. When you sleep, your body puts out moisture. That moisture moves outward through your sleeping bag toward the cooler air outside. If your sleeping bag is exposed to that outside air, the moisture condenses on the outer shell of the sleeping bag, and over several hours the sleeping bag gets damp. Damp insulation doesn't insulate. Caden keeps the sleeping bag inside the tarp so that the moisture hits the inside of the tarp instead of the outside of the sleeping bag. In the morning, he opens the tarp, shakes it off, refolds it. The sleeping bag stays dry. Terrell told him this on night 2. Caden didn't fully believe it until night 15, when he'd been doing it for 2 weeks, and his sleeping bag was still dry, and he remembered what his sleeping bag felt like when he was under that overpass. Damp, heavy, cold in a way that didn't make sense for something rated to 25 degrees. The overhead piece comes next. The loading bay has 2 metal hooks on the back wall, left over from whatever shelving system used to live there. Caden uses a length of paracord, 20 feet of it, $4.50 at a dollar store on 5th, to string a line between those hooks and a pipe that runs along the top of the bay. The cord goes taut, about 5 feet off the ground, running from the back wall to just past the mouth of the bay. On this line, he hangs nothing. The line isn't for the tarp. The line is for the emergency layer. He has a second piece of polyethylene, not a tarp, just a sheet of plastic, the kind used for painting drop cloths, 9 feet by 12 feet, also from the hardware store for $3.20. This goes over the cord and drapes down on both sides. On the outside, the plastic extends past the mouth of the bay and acts as a windbreak. On the inside, it creates a pocket of still air between itself and the back wall of the loading bay. Still air is insulation. Cold air moving is what takes your heat away. The plastic stops it moving. He doesn't use the second sheet every night. If the temperature is above 32 and there's no wind, he skips it. The setup time without it is 14 minutes. The setup time with it is 22. He makes the call at 4 in the afternoon when he checks the weather on his phone. He still has a phone, a prepaid one he charges at the library on Cleveland, and the temperature listed for 2 in the morning is the number he looks at, not the evening temperature. 2 in the morning is when temperatures bottom out, and when his body's core temperature is lowest from sleep. That's the number that determines how he builds tonight. There's a gear store 2 miles from the loading bay. In the outdoor section, they sell a 4-season bivy sack, a waterproof sleeping bag cover, for $180. It does essentially what Caden's tarp wrap does. The moisture management is similar. The ground insulation is not quite as good, because a bivy sack sits on whatever is under it, and doesn't give you the double-layered underfoot barrier Caden gets from the folded tarp plus cardboard. He's checked. He's been in that store twice, not to buy anything, just to look at the product and read what it claims to do and compare it to what he knows from 11 months of sleeping outside in Ohio. The bivy sack solves the condensation problem. It doesn't solve the ground cold problem. His $9.87 tarp, used the way he uses it, solves both. That's not a pitch for the tarp. That's just what happened when he tested both systems on the same ground for the same number of nights. The mornings are their own discipline. Caden is up by 6:15 every day without an alarm. This isn't because he wants to be. It's because the loading bay is behind a street that starts getting foot traffic around 6:30, and he needs to be packed and gone before anyone comes past. Not because of any rule or ordinance. The building is abandoned. Technically, no one's watching, but because showing up at the library or the day center at 7 is easier when no one has recently seen where you slept. It's easier to move through the day. He can't explain it better than that. The pack-out takes 8 minutes. He rolls the tarp from the top edge, pressing the air out as he goes, then folds it into the same rectangle he started with. The sleeping bag compresses into its stuff sack. The plastic sheet goes into a garbage bag he keeps at the bottom of the duffel, specifically for wet gear. The cardboard gets left. Fresh cardboard is easy to find. Carrying it doesn't make sense. He eats something at the day center. The day center opens at 7. They have coffee and usually some kind of breakfast item, bread with peanut butter, sometimes eggs scrambled in a big pan. Caden eats fast and doesn't sit longer than he needs to. He's not unfriendly. He just has a schedule. After the day center, he goes to the library. The Columbus Metropolitan Library on Grant Avenue has outlets along every wall of the reading room. Free Wi-Fi, no time limit on seats as long as you're not sleeping, and you check in every 2 hours at the desk. Caden charges his phone, sometimes reads, sometimes watches videos on how to do things. He's watched probably 40 videos on shelter building, not because he needs to improve his current setup. The setup works, but because he's curious about what else is possible. He watched a video about how the Swedish military trains soldiers to sleep outside in sub-zero weather without commercial gear. He watched one about how people in Mongolia insulate structures with felt. None of this is directly useful. Some of it has changed small things about how he thinks. He found out, through a video made by a wilderness survival instructor in Vermont, that the reason his tarp wrap works as well as it does is related to something called the radiant heat loop, the way your body's warmth bounces back toward you when it hits a reflective or non-porous surface. The tarp isn't reflective, but it's non-porous, which means the warmth that hits it doesn't pass through. It deflects back. He didn't know this was what was happening. He just knew he was warmer. The video gave him the vocabulary for something he'd already built. He mentioned this to Terrell the next day. Terrell said, "Yeah, Terrell doesn't read about why things work. He just knows that they do." Caden has started to think that there are 2 kinds of knowledge, and both of them matter, and the people who have one kind tend to look down on the people who have the other, and that's mostly a waste of time. There's a librarian at the Grant Avenue branch. Caden doesn't know her name. She wears her ID badge turned backwards, which he's always found strange, who stopped and talked to him once in October. Not asked him to leave, not asked him if he needed services, just talked. She'd noticed that he watched a lot of videos about shelter and survival, and she'd asked him if he was interested in architecture. He said, "Kind of." She'd come back 20 minutes later with a stack of books. 2 on vernacular architecture, 1 on emergency shelter design from a FEMA field guide from the 1990s. Said he could take them home. He didn't explain that he didn't have one. He said thank you and read all 3 in the next 4 days. The FEMA guide changed something. Not because it was practical. It was written for disaster relief workers setting up refugee shelters with pallets and lumber. But because it treated shelter design as a problem with rules, variables, and solutions, the same way an engineer treats any problem. Wind direction is a variable. Human body heat output at rest is a variable. Once you see those things as variables rather than just weather, you have to survive, something shifts. You start thinking about your setup as a design, not just a response. Caden started approaching his loading bay the same way. What are the variables here? What can I control? What can I only account for? Wind, partially controllable with the plastic sheet. Ground cold, controllable with the tarp underlay and cardboard. Overhead moisture, controllable with the bay's roof overhang, no additional action needed. Internal condensation, controllable with the sleeping bag inside tarp method. Temperature drop below 18 degrees, not controllable with his current setup. That's the limit. He knows this. Below 18, the setup holds him, but not comfortably. Below 15, he's waking up multiple times. And the different plan is the warming center on Broad Street, which opens at 10 p.m. and closes at 6 a.m. and requires leaving the loading bay unattended, which means potentially losing the cardboard and sometimes the spot itself to someone else. He's used the warming center 4 times. He doesn't prefer it. The room has 80 people in it, and it smells like wet wool, and the lights stay on until midnight. He sleeps worse there than he does in the loading bay at 27 degrees. But at 9 degrees, he goes. That's the number. 9 degrees is when the loading bay stops being the right answer. The worst night Caden can remember was not the coldest. The coldest was a Tuesday in January when the temperature dropped to 9 degrees. And he was fully set up in the loading bay and genuinely warm enough to sleep 6 hours. The worst night was a Thursday in November, earlier, before he knew what he was doing. 34 degrees, freezing rain. He was under the overpass with a sleeping bag that had gotten wet the week before and never fully dried. 34 degrees feels like nothing. 34 degrees with wet gear and no wind barrier will have you shaking so hard you can't hold a thought. He sat up at 2 in the morning and thought about walking to the emergency room just to get somewhere warm. He didn't. He wrapped himself in a garbage bag he found in a pile nearby and kept moving his toes until 5 when the temperature went up a degree and the rain stopped and he could breathe again. That night is the reason he talks about the tarp the way he does. Not as gear, as the thing that made the difference between that night and any night after he learned to use it correctly. He talks to a few other people about setup. There's a woman named Darlene who sleeps in a different part of the east side and who has been outside longer than either Caden or Terrell. She uses a different tarp configuration, 2 tarps, both overhead at different angles, forming a V shape that channels rain away from her sleeping area. She doesn't put anything under herself. She has a foam pad she's carried for 3 years, dense enough that it still has most of its compression. She sleeps on the pad and uses both tarps above her. Her setup is faster than Caden's, 12 minutes, but she's in a location that's more sheltered from ground wind, which is a variable he doesn't have at the loading bay. He's thought about trying her method at his spot. He doesn't think it would work as well because of the ground cold issue, but he's not sure. That's honest. He knows what works for him in his spot. He doesn't know with certainty whether something different would work better. This is the thing about surviving outside. Every setup is a conversation between the person and the specific place they're in. There is no universal right answer. What Terrell does is not what Caden does. And what Darlene does is not what either of them do. And all 3 of them sleep through the night in January, while the people who bought the gear store's $180 bivvy and didn't understand moisture management are waking up cold at 2 in the morning, wondering what they did wrong. He talks to Darlene about the notebook sometimes. She's the only one he's told about it in any detail, because she asked directly and he figured she'd earned the right to a direct answer. She's been outside 9 years. She had a daughter once who lived with her sister in Dayton, and the daughter is grown now and Darlene sees her maybe twice a year, at Christmas and in the summer. The daughter doesn't know exactly how her mother lives. Darlene has decided this is fine. She made that decision a long time ago and doesn't go back to it. She told Caden that having a number is good. Having a plan is good. She also told him not to let the number run his whole life, because he's young, and there's a version of this where you spend so much energy watching the number that you forget to eat enough, sleep enough, let anything in. She said this in about 30 seconds and then changed the subject. He's thought about it most days since. He doesn't think he's in danger of that. He eats when he can and he sleeps as well as the setup allows. And he lets things in, the coffee from Miguel, the FEMA book, the occasional conversation. But he understands what she meant. The number is a target. The target is not the point. Getting out is the point. And getting out starts with getting through tonight, and getting through tonight starts with that tarp. Caden has a plan. He's had it since October. He doesn't talk about it much because he's learned, not from experience, from watching other people, that talking about a plan before it happens changes something in you, makes it feel more real than it is, makes the gap between where you are and where you want to be feel bigger every time you describe it. The plan is this. He's been doing odd jobs, moving furniture, cleaning out garages, yard work, for cash since August. Not every day, some weeks nothing, some weeks $200. He's been keeping track in a notebook, not obsessively, just enough to know where he stands. He needs first and last month's rent, plus a security deposit for the cheapest room he can find in Columbus, which from what he's seen is around $1,400 total in the right part of the east side. He has $870 in the notebook. Not in the notebook, in a rolled-up pair of socks in the bottom of the duffel. He doesn't know when, he knows how much more. He knows what he has to do to get there, and he knows that every night he gets through without losing gear, getting sick, or having something go wrong is a night he keeps the plan alive. The tarp is still $9.87 at the hardware store on Cleveland Avenue. You can go check. Walk in, ask for the 10x 1-2 blue poly tarp, check the price. That's not a number from some study or some article. That's the price on the shelf in the store, 2 miles from where Caden sleeps. The thing keeping a 21-year-old alive through an Ohio winter costs less than a lunch at the sandwich shop next door. What it can't fix is everything else. The tarp doesn't make the cold go away. It doesn't make the morning easier. It doesn't put money in the notebook faster. It doesn't give him a place to store things when he needs to move quickly. It doesn't help on the nights when the loading bay isn't available, when a crew shows up to do work on the building, or when another person has gotten there first. Those nights, Caden improvises with whatever location he can find, and the setup is always worse than the loading bay, and sometimes the sleep is thin and short, and he wakes up stiff. There's a man who runs a food cart near the East Side Library. His name is Miguel, and he's been parking that cart on the same corner for 6 years. He knows Caden by face and occasionally gives him a coffee at the end of the day if there's any left in the urn. Not always. Sometimes the cart is empty before Caden walks past. But sometimes there's half an urn of dark roast going cold, and Miguel will pour it into a cup and not say anything, and Caden will nod and keep walking. It is one of those things that doesn't have a name and doesn't need one. Caden doesn't think of himself as someone people should feel sorry for. He said this out loud exactly once, to Terrell, who didn't respond at all, which Caden took as agreement. He's 21. He got dealt a situation, he's handling it. Those are the facts. The fact that someone had a warm apartment and lost it, or was never in a position to have, one doesn't change what today requires. You still have to lay the cardboard. You still have to fold the tarp right. Feeling sorry about it doesn't change the temperature at 3 in the morning. He thinks about this more than he used to. Not the self-pity question. He's settled on that. He thinks about the version of himself that existed before last January. That version didn't know what wind chill actually felt like on exposed skin after more than 10 minutes. Didn't know the difference between being tired cold, where you want to sleep and feel okay, and being depleted cold, where your thoughts slow down and your hands stop working right. Didn't know that the body's core will sacrifice your fingers and toes to protect your organs, and that you can feel this happening and it is one of the stranger things you can feel. Didn't know any of this. Learned all of it in about 4 months. He's not glad he learned it, but he knows it now, and knowing things has value. And that's where he stops. He's had bronchitis once. His feet gave him trouble in December, something between blisters and frostbite on 2 toes, resolved by spending 3 days off his feet and keeping them dry, which is harder than it sounds when you're outside. He had a week in late October, when everything he owned was wet from a storm that came through faster than the forecast showed, and he spent 3 days getting things dry before he could sleep well again. None of that is solvable by a tarp. It's solvable by not being outside, and he knows that. The tarp is not the answer to his situation. It's the answer to tonight. But tonight matters. Tonight matters so much that you can't think about anything else until you get tonight right. And the people who've never had to think this way have no idea how much of your mind it takes up. Every afternoon around 4, Caden checks the temperature, looks at the loading bay, makes a decision about the plastic sheet, lays the cardboard, sets the tarp. He does this every day. It is not dramatic, it is not remarkable, it is just the thing that has to happen before anything else can. Terrell is still there, near the storm drain. He and Caden don't talk every day, but they check in most days. Sometimes Terrell says something useful, and Caden writes it in the back of the notebook. Not the money section, a different section. Small things. Never put your bag on concrete without something between. If your hands won't warm up, put them in your armpits, not your pockets. Don't drink anything hot right before you sleep. It makes you sweat. Small things. The kind that cost nothing and come from someone who already spent years getting them wrong. The tarp is folded next to the storm drain again this afternoon. Caden dropped it there while he went to fill the water bottle. He'll be back in 8 minutes. The temperature tonight is supposed to be 27, dropping to 21 around 3 in the morning. He'll use the plastic sheet. He'll have the cardboard down before dark. He'll be set up by 6:40, inside and still by 7. Tomorrow morning he'll be packed by 6:20. He'll be at the library by 7:30. He'll add to the notebook, or he won't, depending on whether any work comes through. He'll check the forecast again at 4. He'll make the same decision he's been making every afternoon for 11 months. That's it. That's the whole thing. Not a story about someone who figured it all out. A story about someone who figured out tonight, and then figured it out again tomorrow, and is still figuring it out. $870 in a sock, $530 to go, 1 blue tarp folded into a rectangle the size of a paperback book. Go pull a 10 by 1/2 blue poly tarp off the shelf at any hardware store and hold it in your hands for a minute. That's the thing. That's all of it.